in all 50 of the great and independent states of this nation. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Okay. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January the 5th, 2011, the Chair recognizes the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. King, for 30 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. As always, I'm privileged and honored to be able to address you here on the floor of the United States House of Representatives, and having heard some of the dialogue from the gentleman from Georgia just preceding me, it transitions in a way that I think is fitting at his focus on the 10th Amendment and the limitations of the Constitution that don't seem to be felt by many members of this Congress that serve over on this side as a rule. And the debacle that's been brought upon us, and now we've called upon the Supreme Court to unravel and anticipate a decision as early as next week, no longer this week, I'm told, Madam Speaker. And as I watch this administration unfold, and we're into the 3.5 years or a little bit more of the presidency of Barack Obama, I'm extremely troubled by the constitutional aspects of this administration. And I would frame this with the understanding that the President of the United States is a former adjunct law professor at the University of Chicago who taught constitutional law. He taught constitutional law to students that were to learn about this document that I carry with me in my jacket pocket every day, this Constitution that has as its essential components Article 1, Article 2, and Article 3 of this Constitution. Article 1 sets up the legislature. That's us, Madam Speaker, here in the House of Representatives and down the hallway to the other end of the Capitol, the United States Senate. And it invests in us all legislative authority. That's Article 1. It sets up the legislature. It gives us our authority. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment, Madam Speaker. Article 2 sets up the executive branch of government. It establishes that there shall be a president who is the commander-in-chief of all of our armed forces and a vice president. Beyond that, there's not a requirement that this Congress establish any other parts of the executive branch of government. It just says that we may, not that we shall. And that is in the enumerated powers that this Congress has. The third branch of government, of course, is the judicial branch of government, and it wasn't originally established for the purposes of determining the intent of the letter of the Constitution. It did emerge, and for more than 2 centuries, the landmark precedent case of Marbury versus Madison has not been successfully challenged, although occasionally it's been argued. And so I concede to the Marbury decision, and I look over to the Supreme Court and look to the United States Supreme Court to be the branch of government that determines what the laws mean, that identifies and defines the laws that we pass here. But my disagreement, although I've had some with the Supreme Court in the past, Madam Speaker, is not with the judicial branch of government. I'm looking for them to grant us a decision next week on perhaps 2 large cases that would have come before the court, the Obamacare case and also Arizona's SB 1070 immigration case. And I'm hopeful that they will read this Constitution and understand it as I do and as most of us that take an oath to this Constitution do. But I'm very concerned about the President of the United States, the former adjunct law professor who taught constitutional law at the University of Chicago. And when I had a speaker on this Wednesday morning at a breakfast that I host each week on Wednesdays, what goes on in that room is members only, but it's a Conservative Opportunities Society. And when the speaker that I introduced announced that he received his law degree from the University of Chicago School of Law, it was a bit of an apology for the President's interpretations. And I'm hopeful that the very fine and excellent University of Chicago School of Law doesn't have now a bad reputation it has to peel off that comes from the interpretations of the Constitution that the President is making these days, who taught law there, of course, I would remind you. So I'm very troubled by the actions of the President of the United States, the most recent action that I'm troubled by is, let me say, the amnesty memorandum that he has directed Janet Napolitano to issue. This amnesty memorandum establishes several classes of people. One of those classes, they're defined as this: if they were brought into the United States, or came into the United States is a more accurate way, if they arrived in the United States illegally from a foreign country before they were 16 years old, and if they are still under 30 years old, and if they continuously resided in the United States for 5 years, and if they received a high school degree, a GED, or were honorably discharged from the military. There are a couple other criteria there. Then the President has directed Janet Napolitano, the Secretary of Homeland Security, who has in turn directed her subordinates, that being the acting director of Custom Border Protection, and the director, and that's David Aguilar, the director of ICE, John Morton, and also the USCIS, Mayoncos, who too recognize this memorandum and act as if the President had issued an edict that is actually a law. Now, as Mr. Woodall from Georgia spoke about the Constitution and what's happened to our 10th Amendment, I would suggest that the President seems to be usurping nearly all of Article 1, Section 8 of our Constitution, the enumerated powers. And I came here to speak of these enumerated powers in this way. If the President can manufacture law out of thin air, not whole cloth, Madam Speaker, but out of thin air, we get things like we have immigration law that the United States Congress has established. And it's defined categories of people. It's established numerous visas. It allows for the most generous legal immigration of any country in the world. And some say more legal immigrants coming into the United States every year than are allowed in all other countries in the world put together. I haven't seen that data to my satisfaction. It gets repeated here in this Congress so fairly often. I am very confident the United States is the most generous nation on earth when it comes to legal immigration. A number between 1 and 1.2 million legal immigrants come into the United States. And that number of people happens to be something that would establish workers for every job that's been created for more than a decade here in the United States. I have tracked the U.S. Department of Labor's website and evaluated that, and I'll see that anywhere between 1 and 1.2 million jobs have been created by this economy, and they're all taken up, at least in theory, by new legal immigrants. Then we have 12 to 20 million illegal immigrants, 7 out of 12 of which are out working, and the other 5 out of that 12 are presumably not working or in the home, perhaps. And those jobs are maybe not recorded by the Department of Labor because they aren't legitimate jobs from their statistical standpoint. But imagine this. Imagine an economy that generates over 1 million jobs a year, and imagine a country that would open its doors to over 1 million immigrants a year, watch the economy create these jobs and watch those jobs being used by legal immigrants, and then turn a blind eye towards the illegal immigrants that are coming into the United States. The people on the other side of the aisle see illegal immigrants as undocumented Democrats. It is a political equation for them. It's not an equation of what's good for America's economy, what's good for America's culture, what's good for America's society. It's what gives them political power. So they cynically turn a blind eye and encourage that laws not be enforced, erode the rule of law, and in the process of expanding their political base, they're eroding the core of America and creating a greater and greater disrespect for the rule of law. That's chiseling away at one of those beautiful pillars of American exceptionalism. And the President leads the charge, Madam Speaker. This lawless memorandum that was issued by Secretary Napolitano at the direction of President Obama has no basis in constitutional authority. The President of the United States does not have the authority to create law. He has no authority to pull it out of thin air. He cannot simply announce that he's going to require us to follow some directive, some executive edict, and expect us to follow it. It is an unconstitutional overreach and a violation of the separation of powers. Now, I have some experience with this, but the President's move on this amnesty memorandum, is a clear violation of the executive powers of the President of the United States. It is one of the enumerated powers that is given to the United States Congress in Article 1, Section 8. If the President can manufacture immigration law, here's what he has done. I'll put this poster up. Madam Speaker, this is the result of the President's action, and that is, first he created the categories that I mentioned, 3 or 4 categories of people that are classes of people. He has prosecutorial discretion to decide where they're going to emphasize the utilization of their enforcement resources. He can determine that they're going to put more people on violent criminals, more people on serious drug smugglers. I'm not sure they are, but he can determine that they are. I haven't raised an issue with his constitutional authority to do that. I did bring an amendment a couple of weeks ago that blocked the Morton memos, which did say we're not going to enforce laws against individuals who have found themselves in the United States and haven't violated other laws. And the President has argued before the Supreme Court that there's this careful balance, a careful balance theory that is that Congress has directed the executive branch to create and maintain a careful balance of various immigration laws so that the executive branch interests in the State Department, in Department of Homeland Security, and Department of Commerce, those departments find that balance so we don't over-enforce and offend our neighbors. Congress did not direct the President or the executive branch to create or maintain a careful balance. That careful balance is a completely manufactured theory. Congress passed laws of all kinds under the authority granted to it in Article 1, Section 8, and in those directives to the executive branch are, keep your oath of office, Mr. President. Executive branch, Eric Holder, keep your oath of office. And that oath for the President of the United States says, I do solemnly swear to the best of my ability to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, so help me God. Those were the words of Barack Obama, January 20th, 2009, right out here on the west portico of the Capitol. Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, so help me God. And intrinsic with that oath of office, a little bit later in Article 2, the Constitution says, of the President, he shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. That means enforce the laws. The President must enforce the laws. He must appoint people whose job it is to enforce the laws. He must direct that they do so. They take an oath to uphold the Constitution. Eric Holder has an obligation to enforce the law. Janet Napolitano has an obligation to enforce the law. And their oath is tied to the Constitution in the same way. They understand that when they put their hand on the Bible and raise their right hand and say, I do solemnly swear, that includes take care that the laws be faithfully executed. That's the obligation of the executive branch of government. The obligation of the legislative branch of government is to pass laws that be necessary and proper. In fact, Madam Speaker, among Article 1, Section 8 of the enumerated powers is the necessary and proper clause, which says, to Congress, the legislative branch, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. That's the full list of enumerated powers that come before it in Article 1, Section 8, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. Necessary and proper clause includes exclusive authority to pass laws is vested in the legislative branch in government. If it's exclusive, that means the President of the United States and nobody outside this legislature can pass a law. The President believes he can do that. He believes he can create legislation out of thin air, and he did so by the effect of his memorandum that was released by Janet Napolitano last Friday and supported in a Rose Garden speech by the President of the United States about 2:40 p.m. last Friday. And here's what we have. As a result of that is amnesty for whole classes of people. Between 800,000 and 1.4 million people granted a legal status in this country that as of the morning, last Friday morning when they woke up, they were subject to being put back in the condition they were in before they broke the law. That is, back to their home country where they rightfully belong and legally could reside. The President changed that with an unconstitutional overreach that's a violation of this separation of powers, and I'm going to ask the court to resolve this disagreement. It will take some time, it will take some money, it will take some effort and some litigation brains. They are, I believe, ready to go on this, Madam Speaker. But here's what the result of the President's memo, and it's this: created those classes of people, granted them executive amnesty by memo printed by Janet Napolitano, Director of Homeland Security, and directed the Director of USCIS, United States Citizenship Immigration Services, to create a permit that would allow those formerly illegal individuals to work in the United States for the duration of this permit that he would require. Now, I've just looked at a couple of these things. These are created by laws, acts of Congress. This is an employment authorization card. It's just a model or a sample of one. It doesn't actually identify a real individual. And this is the size of a credit card. And it says U.S. Department of Homeland Security, U.S. Citizenship Immigration Services, USCIS. This is what the President has directed that USCIS create to hand to these 1 or so million people that get their new amnesty by executive fiat. Here is your employment authorization card. This is what will be produced, not by the direction of the United States Congress, not under the authority of the Article 1 of the Constitution that established this legislature, but under the arrogant assumed power of the President of the United States to issue a memo that he thinks he has the authority to issue. And by the way, power in this world has historically been what you're able to assert and retain. If anyone steps up and assumes power to do something, if there's no one there to challenge them and they can get away with it, they have that power. And they will hold that power. It will be a precedent for that power until someone can challenge it and take it away from them, Madam Speaker. And so the President has assumed this unconstitutional power to create entire classes of people grouped in the hundreds of thousands, grant to them an employment authorization card, and grant to them a resident card. Excuse me. Now, the resident card that the President has ordered USCIS to produce in an unlawful, unconstitutional fashion will likely look something like this. This is a copy of what we know as a green card. It's a lawful permanent resident card. LPR status is what we call it. It says right here, permanent resident card, and again, this is just a token individual, a model for the card. But, Madam Speaker, they'll probably just strike out permanent resident and they'll say, might say temporary resident. It might have some kind of indication that later on he's going to make them a permanent resident. If the President can manufacture authority to do this when it doesn't exist, if he can grant amnesty to people that fit the age categories that he says, that haven't committed violent or serious felonies or too many strings of misdemeanors, if he can do that, then why can't he also grant amnesty to those that are over 16 when they came here, those that are over 30 today, those that have been in the United States for less than 5 years, those that may have committed felonies and he just wants to give them a pass? We already have amnesty in this country for the President of the United States' aunt, who had been adjudicated for deportation, Auntie Onyango, and we already have amnesty from the administration for his drunken uncle Omar, who nearly ran over a police officer and had a 1.4 blood alcohol content, and then after he was brought to court, his punishment was to suspend his driver's license, and then the state of Massachusetts issued him a 45-day driver's license. These laws don't apply to the relatives of the President of the United States. Apparently, they don't apply to the President's preferred manufactured classes of people. And by the way, the Constitution, according to his view, doesn't apply either to the President of the United States. This is what he has created out of whole cloth. These cards that you see here, this is a result of a deliberative act of the United States Congress. The U.S. House of Representatives, the United States Senate have concurred that we want to give people who are in this country legally an employment authorization card when they qualify. We want to give them a permanent resident card, a lawful permanent status card, when they qualify. And this green card, by the way, is a path to citizenship. Carrying this green card around for 5 years, being president of the United States, obeying our laws, that opens the door to United States citizenship, and after that 5-year period of time, the green card can be converted, and often is, into United States citizenship. What prevents the president from just granting citizenship to all of the people that he thinks might vote for him? If the president has the authority to manufacture out of thin air this permit and this permit, Madam Speaker, under the same assumed arrogant authority, the president would be able to grant amnesty to 12 or 20 million people, instantly make them citizens, and march them off to the polls. He's engaged in blocking the state of Florida and 5 other states from cleaning up their voting rolls, has sent his Attorney General, Eric Holder, to block Florida from cleaning illegals off of the voting rolls in Florida. And that's not the only state. There's a database called the SAVE database. It's in the control of Janet Napolitano, Department of Homeland Security. The Secretary of State of the state of Iowa, Matt Schultz, who is doing an excellent job of making sure that those of us who have a legitimate vote in the state don't see our vote diluted or offset by the vote of someone who is unlawfully in the United States or not a citizen, or perhaps a felon or deceased. We need voter registration lists that are free of duplicates, deceased, and felons, and that certifies that they are citizens and require a picture ID. And the Holder Justice Office, working with the assent, if not the encouragement of the Obama White House, is blocking the legitimate cleanup of the voter registration rolls in state after state after state. This is the most unconstitutional reach by the executive in the history of the United States. And here are some things that the president could do if we let him assert his authority. I'll go all the way down through and just pick the most important ones in Article 1, Section 8, the enumerated powers of our Constitution. The first power is grants Congress, exclusively Congress, the authority to lay and collect taxes. What if the president decided by executive fiat that he didn't want to collect taxes against people in the lowest bracket, because after all, that would be an income redistribution thing that he's likely to favor? Do you think those folks would feel good about the President of the United States and maybe go to the polls and vote for him? Would that change the political dynamic in the country if they didn't have a tax liability? Probably. If that's his calculus, what prevents him if he can do this? If he thinks he has the power to lay and collect taxes, he can always absolve people of those taxes as well. What if Mitt Romney is elected President of the United States and he decides that in order to stimulate the economy, he would just waive the taxes on U.S. capital that's stranded overseas, on the trillions of dollars, waive the capital gains taxes, let those resources come back into the United States tax-free and be reinvested in the economy? Does the President have the authority to waive taxes, or does the President have the authority to lay and collect them? No, Madam Speaker, he does not. The President of the United States has the obligation to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. The authority to legislate is exclusively within the United States Congress, House and Senate, with the consent then of the signature of the President or the overriding of his veto. The President could, under the same rationale as he has here, lay and collect taxes or waive taxes on certain classes of people. What if he decided that I feel a little sorry for those people that I wrote into this memorandum, so I don't want them to pay taxes either? Would then America be outraged? I'd say we need to understand this Constitution better, and we will be more outraged. What about borrowing money? That's another enumerated power, to borrow money on the credit of the United States. What if the President of the United States decided, under the same authority he's assigned himself here, that he's not going to pay any attention to Congress on whether we agree to lifting the debt ceiling? He's just going to go by executive order or presidential fiat and direct the Department of the Treasury to go ahead and borrow money beyond the debt ceiling this Congress has set. What would we say then, Madam Speaker? How about this? To regulate commerce. Well, wait, they're already doing that. They're alleging that under the Commerce Clause of the Constitution that they can go ahead and declare breathing only one lungful of American air constitutes engaging in interstate commerce, and they can compel you to buy a health insurance policy that's written or approved by the federal government. That's a decision that we expect from the Supreme Court next week. I think it's going to be a constitutional one. Barack Obama asserts that the Commerce Clause is so broad that Congress can reach across all state lines and declare that breathing one lungful of American air is enough to engage in interstate commerce, and therefore they can regulate all activities that they can declare to be interstate commerce. That means all activities whatsoever. And by the way, I will say that if the Commerce Clause is so broadened by the consent of the Supreme Court next week, then the Commerce Clause itself swallows all of the enumerated powers. Everything can be regulated within the Commerce Clause. But I'm really here to focus on the difference, on the separation of powers between the legislative and the executive branch. And so I'd take us to naturalization. The enumerated powers grant that power of a naturalization to establish an uniform rule of naturalization to the United States Congress exclusively, not that of the President of the United States. The President has argued that exclusive rule of naturalization includes all immigration laws and that the Congress should be able to determine that, and there is no 10th Amendment that applies. That's another case before the Supreme Court that I expect we will get a decision upon next week. But this stretch of the rationale that the President has sent does great offense to the Constitution of the United States. Regardless, this Congress has the exclusive constitutional authority to establish a uniform rule of naturalization. The President can't write that. The states can't write that. But the states do have the authority to write immigration laws that mirror those of the United States government. The President can't write them as he intends to do. This is what he's created. Unconstitutionally, he's created these permits and these classes of people. The President has also declared that the Senate wasn't in session when they were in session and committed his recess appointments. And I'm disappointed, frankly, Madam Speaker, that the United States Senate didn't step up and defend its authority to determine when they were in session and to not adjourn and to be in a pro forma session. They did so the President could not insert recess appointments, and the President did so anyway. If the President of the United States can declare that the United States Senate is not in session, then he can effectively abolish the United States Senate except for it being just simply a symbolic body. Now, there are countries around the world like that, in this hemisphere, I might add. I remember seeing the President of the United States in a glad double-handed handshake with one of those people a few years ago. Then I mentioned SB 1070, this great overreach where the President has he sent his Attorney General to sue Arizona. He was classically asked the question, Attorney General Holder, did you read the Arizona immigration bill? His answer was no. And Congressman Ted Poe said, here, you can read mine. It's only 10.5 pages long. It's not that hard to study. I'd read it. Ted Poe had read it. So had, I think, every member of the Judiciary Committee on our side. But the Attorney General had determined he was going to sue Arizona because he was ordered to by the President of the United States. And the announcement came in Ecuador from the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton. That's how we found out. And they created a whole new legal argument called the careful balance theory, that Congress had directed the executive branch to create and maintain a careful balance between the various immigration laws. We did no such thing. There is no record of this. There's no statute of this. There's no dialogue in the congressional record that would direct such a thing. They asserted it because that was the only argument they could manufacture that suited their political position. This is not an administration of law. It's not administration bound by it. They are not bound by the Constitution. The President himself has stood before this nation multiple times and given the lecture about the separation of powers. Congress passes the laws, the executive branch carries them out, and the Supreme Court and the judicial branch interprets the laws. That's the President's lecture. And he cast it all aside and asserted an executive edict that he could create these things out of thin air. If the President can do so, then, as we go on down the line, he can regulate commerce, he can do the naturalization. The President's already stuck his nose in the bankruptcies, and the secured creditors for Chrysler saw themselves aced out while the White House was the only appraiser of Chrysler Motors. They wrote the terms of the Chapter 11 for Chrysler, and they were the only company that was the only entity that was bidding on Chrysler's assets. They set the price going in, they wrote the terms of the bankruptcy, and they offered the price on the other side of it. And what did they do? They scooped the secured creditors' assets away and handed them over to the unions. Congress sets the terms of bankruptcy, not the White House. Again, he's crossed the line. We go on down the line. What if the President decided that he could establish the currency of the United States? That's exclusively the Congress as well. What if he determined the euro was going to be the currency of the United States of America? What could we do? What would our alternative be? We'll take the gentleman to the courts and ask the courts to determine the difference. In the end, the people will decide this. Intellectual property, he could waive copyrights, trademarks, and those types of laws. Or he could create tribunals or wipe them out if he's going to assert an authority to rewrite Article 1, Section 8. Madam Speaker, I appreciate your attention. We must keep our oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States and the separation of powers. I intend to do so. I ask everyone's help in this whole country, and I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January the 5th, 2011, the Chair recognizes the gentleman from New Mexico, Mr. Pierce, for 30 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity to address the House on a matter of the West. There are major fires burning across the western United States. There's tremendous property damage and tremendous damage to the environment. Habitat for endangered species is being burned up in the hundreds of thousands of acres. The species themselves are being destroyed and killed in these massive wildfires. And the Chief of the United States Forest Service says we need to introduce fire back into our forests. I asked the Chief just this week as he visited in the office here in Rayburn with me. I said, Chief, this is what it looks like when you reintroduce fire into the forest in the West right now. The forests are chock full of fuel. Decades of mismanagement by our Forest Service has allowed the fuels to build up to where it's a dangerous, explosive environment. The drought, which actually occurs regularly in the West, has caused those buildup of fuels to be explosive in nature, and when fire gets loose, this is what it looks like. This is the town of Ruidoso, New Mexico, in my district, and these are the flames that burn, and it makes it look like Hades has taken over all of New Mexico. Is this what you intended, Mr. Tidwell? Is this what you describe as allowing fire to run its course and to accomplish management objectives in your forests? You're the one responsible, sir. Thank God for the firefighters who will come out and fight to save the community. Thank God for the men and women who will stand in harm's way to stop this, but this should not be occurring. Right next to this forest is the Lincoln National Forest, and right next door, the Mescalero Apaches have about the same acreage of forests. With 14 people, they're able to clean their forest out. They're able to harvest the timber. When the fire gets to the Indian reservation, it simply drops down on the ground and becomes a grass fire, the way that fires typically ran in New Mexico and throughout the West. History shows us that in our forest we generally had somewhere between 50 and 100 trees per acre in the arid West on our forest lands. There were grassy savanna lands mostly with widely scattered trees. It never became more than a grass fire, but our tree rings show us that about every 8 years, a very hot fire would come through, burning all of the grass and the underbrush, the ladder fuels, burning the small diameter trees while they're still small. But decades of putting out fires and decades of not harvesting any timber at all have allowed our forests to become explosive cauldrons which are breaking into fire. Now the shame is that this fire in New Mexico started as 1/4 acre, and for about a day it stayed about 1/4 of an acre. And then it spread to 4 acres for the next 3 days. Still, no call for tankers, no call for those aerial drops of water or the slurry which puts out the fire. None. Not until the 4th day, late in the 4th day. The Forest Service says they can't ask questions like this about those decisions. I think that the decisions locally are made by people who are trying to follow the policy of reintroducing fire into the forest. Regional Forester Corbin Newman recently stated, fire will have to take its natural course. And we're just trying to put fire back into its natural processes, he said. This rings the same tone as was stated by Mr. Tidwell in my office this week, that we want fire to get back into the forest. Well, fire in the forest had a natural process when the forest was in balance. The forest is desperately out of balance right now. This is not the first brush with disaster that we've had, and keep in mind that the Forest Service personnel themselves said they were worried about losing the entire town of Ruidoso, that it was at high risk, not just at risk, but at high risk was their statement as we were briefed about the fire. But we had warning signs last year. This is what it looked like last year in Ruidoso. High winds and a small fire began to throw embers throughout the town. And you can see the little spots of fires over and through the mountains that are in and around Ruidoso. We began to sound the alarm at that point to our Forest Service, please clean the fuels out. We can't stand for this to run wild. And this year it has run wild and destroyed 242 homes in this area and more outbuildings, more structures beyond just the loss of homes. This is not necessary. All is required is for us to manage the forest properly. It's a call that is going out from the people who live in the forest throughout the West. They're watching their wilderness areas, they're watching the forest lands burn to charred masses, and the Forest Service personnel themselves, the specialists, are telling me that trees will not grow here for another 100 to 150 years. How is it managing our forests to burn the trees for 150 years? How is that good for the environment? How is that good for the species? And how is it good for the people who live in this area? Shame on you, Forest Service. Shame on you for dictating policies to local managers who know better. Shame on you, Mr. Newman and Mr. Tidwell, for saying that we're going to reintroduce fire into our forest and let it run its natural course. The forest in and around Lincoln County, some has been cleared and harvested. We're not saying to we're not saying to clear cut our forests. What we're saying is that a balanced thinning program will go through and leave widely spaced trees. This is similar to how it looks on the Mescalero Reservation, and also it's similar to how it looks at Fort Apache in Arizona. Last year, the Wallow Fire burned 500,000 acres in the Wallow area, the Wallow Fire in Arizona and New Mexico. But when it got to Fort Apache, it simply fell down on the ground and stopped right there because they had thinned their forest. This is what a forest should look like in the West. There's not enough rain and not enough nutrients to support 2,500 trees per acre. This is the way forest looked in the West when fire had its way, when fire ran its course. Instead, our forests today are densely packed, 2,500 trees per acre, and this is the outcome when you see that. That's what the U.S. Forest Service looks like in most places. A deep contrast to what it should look like, and it is into this forest that the head of the Forest Service, the chief of the Forest Service, is saying that we're trying to reintroduce fire into the wilderness and into our forests. It's a misguided approach. That idea that we're going to reintroduce fire is playing Russian roulette with our national forest and our wilderness. It's a game that is not working out too well. We have two major fires in southern New Mexico right now. We have the Little Bear Fire in Ruidoso, but over in the Gila we've got 300,000 acres of land that is burned there. A strong mix of combination between the Gila Wilderness and the Gila National Forest. Again, it started as a small fire. It started as a small fire, and the Forest Service releases say that they are monitoring it, that it's achieving its management objectives. I'm sorry, but management objectives of using fire in drought-stricken areas of the West, in forests that are chock full of fuels, is misguided at the very least. Now, the people who live and have lost much have suffered deeply. The Forest Service needs to be responsible for those losses. But additionally, they should be responsible for the loss in tax base to the local communities. They should be responsible to local homeowners whose value of their homes is going to be depreciated for decades because people who move close to the national forest want to be there with that natural beauty, and instead they're going to be faced with a brush pile that doesn't grow trees for the next 100 to 150 years, according to their specialists. So what are we to do? Are we to stand by and allow our forest to burn because of policies that originate in Washington? Are we to put at risk the lives of local people? Are we to put at risk the property values of local people? Or are we to call on common sense? Just a pragmatic understanding that you cannot use fire to achieve the balance when the forests are full of fuel. We have deep disagreements with our Forest Service on their policies. We have deep love for the people who manage the forest out in the field and for the firefighters who risk their lives. We're thankful every day that they're there 24 hours a day, around the clock, 7 days a week, away from their families, to protect us. But they should not have to protect us in this fashion. It's expensive. It's expensive in the loss of our forest. It's expensive in the cost, the dollar cost of the fire. This fire in Lincoln County was running about $2 million a day to try to put it out. The one on the other side of the state in the Gila was running about $1 million a day. But that is not the only problem that we face. Now that the trees are gone, when it rains, the rainwater is going to rush off the hills into the valleys, and it's going to rush down the valleys, and we're going to see flooding. If you go to the web page that we have for our congressional office, you'll be able to see a dramatic video called the Dixon Apple Orchard Flood. That's up to just above the Santa Clara Pueblo in northern New Mexico. People from that pueblo were waiting for the water that they knew would come, and they videoed several different spots. So take a moment and look at that, if you would, to see now the next calamity that is going to face New Mexico. Because when you burn the trees, there's nothing now to stop the water from rushing off the hill. It's going to carry topsoil with it. It's going to carry rocks and boulders, and it's going to flood towns completely off the face of the earth. One of the people fighting the fire out west in the Gila said that that area would be some of the most dramatic flood potential that he had ever fought fires in. That is, the canyons are so steep and so deep, and they come together. 9 canyons come together at Glenwood. All of that water is going to be pouring through the small town. Mogollon, New Mexico sits right at the mouth of one of those canyons. High, steep canyon walls on both sides of it. It's at the bottom of the V. And those communities that have existed for decades, Santa Clara, which has existed for hundreds of years, is going to face flooding, not because of anything they've done, but because of the way that the Forest Service has managed its lands. the way that the Forest Service has managed those resources that we asked for them to take care of, so that we all might enjoy the benefits and the beauty of our nation's landscape. And yet we're not going to be able to see that, and we're going to be exposed to floods for decades to come. What kind of sense does that make from Washington? People across America are beginning to say that our government is broken. They're saying it's broken because of policies that result in fires like the one that we just showed the picture of. People are saying that this is not responsible, that a government who would say that we're going to reintroduce fire into the forest with this kind of result. What kind of responsibility is that? That's the question that we're here tonight to ask. It's not reasonable to expect people to just stand back and say nothing. And so we are accepting an invitation to speak at a public rally where people are going to express their concerns, their fears, and express their losses in this fire, a fire that we've had decades to prepare in. Several years ago, we had a fire on the backside of Capitan Mountain, just in this same area. And the local forest supervisor said, well, it was a small fire, 15 acres, and it didn't justify bringing in air tankers and more resources. It blew out of control and became a 58,000-acre fire. It's that mindset that we're not going to address the fire situation totally that is putting the West at risk right now. In Colorado, that fire, we actually lost the life of a citizen who couldn't get out of her cabin. When are we going to start managing properly? It's the question that lies before us all. Us as a nation, us as a Congress, and the U.S. Forest Service, and the head of the Agriculture Department who manages them. It's a tragedy what's going on in the most pristine parts of our country, wilderness areas where fuels have been allowed to burn and where we're going to see the absolute destruction. It's not a matter of if our forests will burn. It's simply a question of when they're going to burn. Now, we can manage differently and we can manage better, but we absolutely have to make the commitment that we're going to give up the policies that are failing and move into a new thought process. In visiting with the head of the U.S. Forest Service this week, I asked about a policy that used to exist to put out fires. It was called the 10 a.m. policy. That is, if we see a fire running at any time today, we're going to put it out by 10 a.m. tomorrow. And if we don't get it out by 10 a.m. tomorrow, we're going to put it out by 10 a.m. the next day. The head of the Forest Service, Mr. Tidwell, said yes. It was very successful. In fact, he said it was too successful. Too successful? How can you be too successful in putting out these fires? Too successful? That was his statement. That yes, it worked too well. Well, Mr. Tidwell, I want it to work too well because I don't want the forest to look like this. I don't want our communities to be greatly at risk. This is your standard operating practice. This is the outcome. I want you to go back to the 10 a.m. policy that says put it out by tomorrow at 10 a.m. Then let's go in and let's start clearing our forests and cutting the fuels out. Let's start actually managing those forests, and then we'll stop burning them up. Then they'll be healthy forests, widely spaced trees. They have enough nutrients. The bark beetles won't be able to get into them because they'll be big, healthy trees. Right now, the bark beetles are killing millions of trees across the West because they're starved for nutrients. They're like children that don't have enough nutrition. They're weak. They're spindly. They're susceptible to not only fire, but disease and insects. And all of our specialists tell us, but we don't make a change. We've got many mountain communities in New Mexico. All of them face this same risk. We're not going to stand idly by while our chief U.S. forester says it's time to reintroduce fire back into our forest. I'm sorry. I disagree with the concept that our wildernesses will become charred stumps, that our national forest will not grow trees for 100 to 150 years because the heat of these fires calcify the soil sometimes as deep as 3 feet. It turns it almost into a glass where the trees can't get root. Only the grass and small shrubs that are able to get some rain at the top of the surface will penetrate this. We've got an area like that close to Cloudcroft, New Mexico, a very hot fire in the early 50s. It still is only shrubs. We haven't grown that forest back. So I believe when the specialists tell me it's going to be 100 to 150 years, I've seen at least 50 in that one forest myself. So I know that they're saying partial truths, and I think it to be complete truths. Why are we accepting this management process on our nation's forests? It doesn't make sense. It is extremely costly to people. It's extremely costly to the government. We can and should use the resources of this country better and more fairly. We should allow our species to have forests to live in, not to burn them out and not to burn the species up. The spotted owl lives in this area, and you can see what's happening to his habitat. You can see what's happened to the spotted owls who actually were here. They don't exist anymore. The Fish and Wildlife Service in the past has said that this fire runs less risk to the spotted owl than logging. How can you say that, let me have the other poster, how can you say that this is less dangerous than doing this? The logic is completely missing. Actually, the spotted owl thrives in these circumstances. The mescaleros tell us that they have numerous pairs that are coming back into the reservation because they have widely spaced trees. The spotted owl actually roosts in the tree, uses its altitude to glide off, catch its prey, and come back up. It cannot do that in this forest, and it can do it in this forest. So every argument that we are being faced with right now does not make logical sense as we talk about the policy here in Washington, D.C. It's a discussion that has now started in earnest in the West. The eastern states, number one, don't have the problem with the drought, and number two, they don't have as much public land as we have in the West. It is the West that is burning up. It is us in the West. The Western Caucus, I'm the chairman of that, is taking the lead in voicing our complaint, our frustration, and our fears for our population because of the management of the forest in the West. Again, our highest compliments to the foresters who live and work in the West. It is not them. It is the policies coming from Washington, D.C. It's the culture, it's the thought process that somehow tries to justify the actions which are causing these monstrous, massive fires. We need to stop it today. We need to stop it now. We need to manage properly for the future so that all might enjoy these precious resources. And, Madam Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Does the gentleman have a motion?
Move that we would adjourn until Tuesday.
The question is on the motion to adjourn. Those in favor say yea. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. Accordingly, the House stands adjourned until 2 p.m. on